Hello, I'm Haseeb. I'm an artist, and today I'll be presenting the Wind Avatar, also on behalf of the Brain and Emotion Laboratory with Dr. Beatrice de Gelder, who's also here, but presenting on behalf of her, which is part of the Dance Consortium. For me, the Wind Avatar project and the STARTS Residency was a way of deepening an artistic engagement that I'd had already for quite some time. So I'll also give you some of the background of that information, which now continues. So my engagement with wind started about 8 years ago. So I've been working with wind and wind tunnels since 2008 when I was at the program for art, culture, and technology at MIT. I got really fascinated by wind tunnels because they're a space which is quite paradoxical. Those things that would normally move through the air are now held stationary, and the air moves past them. So it's a kind of inversion of movement. Instead of distance, things moving over distance, we just have time in this sense. So for me, this space also produces the possibilities for creating moments that would otherwise be impossible. And in this case, I created a piece where I put a replica of a 17th century Persian sword in the wind tunnel, and the wind was moving past the sword at the speed at which the sword would cut through the air. So in this case, the fleeting moment, which would only last a kind of instant, was extended indefinitely or infinitely as long as the wind tunnel was running. So this moment of a kind of infinite cut. What I find interesting about this paradox too is that wind tunnels are used to verify or to study our everyday realities, but they create a reality which only exists inside of them as well. So after this experience, I continued to work with I found it important to work with the tools and technologies that are shaping our everyday lives beyond traditional artistic media, which are simply depicting them oftentimes. And so I applied to the Von Karman Institute for Fluid Dynamics, and here's my application. It worked for some reason, despite the photo. The Von Karman Institute is one of Europe's largest and oldest aeronautics research institutes in Rose-Saint-Genès in Belgium, just outside of Brussels. And it was a place that was important for integrating post-World War II advances between the Allies and the Axis in aeronautics. So in this place, I also conducted my own work, where I tried to create a 4-year-long experiment examining the wind egg experiment, which is this notion, ancient conception that wind can fertilize animals and people the way that it does plants. And I tried to make this real using the wind tunnel technology at the institute. During this time, it was often thought that certain animals were only female and only reproduced with the wind, including vultures. And that was my starting point, which was interesting because vultures are often associated with death. So how can we think about it for using thinking about new forms of conception in this way? Yeah, another kind of extension, if we can say, okay, that the wind is then creating this kind of conception in at the Von Karman Institute. I also conducted another experiment, which in the wind tunnel here, you'll see in the foreground, we were also able to find the face of the wind in the turbulence patterns of trailing a delta wing. And if you want to see how it moves, it looks like this. So in this case, it became, for me, it was interesting, this kind of anthropomorphization of the wind. Is this actually the face of the wind itself that we've kind of uncovered, or is it also the projection of our kind of anthropocentric tendencies onto a turbulence pattern, a natural turbulence pattern? And also, can we distinguish between natural occurrences and also humanity in the moment of the Anthropocene? So here I tried to kind of pair it with vernacular emotional expressions, which are also which are also symbolic in this case, which are emoticons. this project has had multiple iterations. So at the just recently at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp, I created an entire installation about this wind egg project, and we created the Tower of the Winds here to house the face of the wind. The Tower of the Winds is a kind of a replica or iteration on the Tower of the Winds, which is located in Athens, Greece, which is thought to be the world's first weather station, covered with sundials, and also used to house a water clock. For me, this is also an important strategy of kind of bracketing, bringing the past into communication with the present and technology to try to locate where we are in the present, which is often very slippery. It's kind of this expression, hindsight is 20/20, or the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, as Hegel would say. So we only know things as they're over, once they've passed. And so how can we create a register? And that's what I try to do when I use technology and also things that are coming from the distant past together. So in the next steps, we kind of roboticized the wind tunnel and added motors and input controls so that the delta wing would turn and could move, and that could change the facial expressions of the wind. In the first iteration at the museum, it was the inputs were coming from the Twitter bot, which was gathering data from every line of weather stations at every line of longitude all over the world. So it was reporting on the speed and the direction of the wind, which was then being input into the delta wing, which was changing, and then the facial expression in the wind tunnel itself was changing. So the face we see in the wind tunnel was the expression of all of the world's winds. We also tried to teach it how to speak and expose it to all different kinds of language, which in particular I thought this poem was very apt, which is The Red-Haired Man by Daniel Harms, a Russian futurist poet, who speaks about there being no man at all. And now for the Wind Avatar project, working with Dr. Beatrice de Gelder in the lab, they're often working on how are emotional states registered in nonverbal cues, and how do they express themselves through things like bioelectric feedback signals that you can register. So they're working with VR, oftentimes exposing the body to certain stimuli and situations, and then registering those effects. So here's an example of EEG cap. A possibility for doing motion tracking with pupils. This is a little bit speculative at this moment still, but and then also measuring pulse and different elements like this. So the notion is like or the project allows for the possibility that the emotions that somebody is feeling in their body can be expressed by the face of the wind here. The idea is also like possibly, originally the dance project was working with people who are blind, but my goal, and this will be presented at the Theatre of Liège for the Impact Festival in Belgium in November, and the possibility, thought now is to have performers who are operating this kind of apparatus, people who are physically impaired and cannot move, so how can they occupy and embody the wind and all of the freedom of the wind, which is a kind of non-corporeal state moving freely throughout space. So this is the face. And as a kind of like epilogue or addendum, since I have even 1 minute left to go, I'd like to kind of ask the question, like, why working with the wind and why working with technology? I think for me what's interesting is arriving at a moment in which we have this idea that technology will save us. And for me, what's interesting is when we work with technology, how can we reverse engineer the social conditions and the kind of political imaginary that leads us to this situation that working with technology in the sciences is going to kind of create a redemption or save our planet and our society. And by extension, that kind of imaginary leads us to think that art should be giving new forms of innovation, new forms of novelty for this kind of technology that will save us. But actually, for me, what's interesting is how do we deepen our understanding of a social situation which has produced a very problematic kind of social reality and physical reality, which is quite self-destructive. And so that's a bit what I would like to be able to read back when we see the face of the wind here. which is also the accumulation of generated by wind tunnels, which of course have been advanced through military technology primarily, but then feeding into civil and social reality. And what's also, I mean, there is a slight bit of novelty in my project, I have to say too, because it's maybe perhaps, as far as I've seen, the first kind of encounter between brain and cognitive sciences and fluid dynamics. So this is also, yeah, for me, kind of exciting and something to deepen, because these fields would normally not touch ever. So, okay, thank you very much.